Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast on the new early years foundation stage profile assessment, which is statutory for the first time in summer term 2022. My name is Anna Jones, and I work in the early years foundation stage team at the Department for Education. The vodcast is primarily for reception teachers and for leaders in schools, but we are also encouraging all local authorities to watch it as well, and we will be sharing the same messages with early years sector bodies and other sector stakeholders. So in terms of what the podcast will cover, I'm going to go through an overview of the early years foundation stage reforms and what's different about the new EYFSP assessment. In doing that, I'll make sure that I cover all requirements for schools and set out what DfE and Ofsted expectations are on how the profile should be completed. And I'll also be covering the EYFSP dataset and how that should be used as well. I'm going to talk about the new case study exemplification videos and how they're intended to be used. And then finally, I'll be providing links to where you can find further information on the reforms and how to deliver the new EYFS. So to begin, I wanted to start with a reminder of the reforms and why we've made the changes and what we want to achieve. So the process for reforming the EYFS began in 2017 with the primary assessment consultation. And it was through that consultation that we heard some quite strong calls from across the sector for the EYFSP to be retained as a valued assessment, but to be improved to better assess children's development at the end of reception year, and also to make the process for both administering and moderating the EYFSP more useful and efficient. So it's through that consultation that we heard that the ELGs needed to be clearer and more focused, as well as better aligned with expectations in year one to ensure a smooth transition for children. We also heard that they needed to be more firmly based on the latest evidence on child development, and in particular that was through the inclusion of elements such as self-regulation and a greater focus on acquisition of vocabulary throughout all 17 ELGs, and also from the removal of some aspects as well, so for example the technology early learning goal. We also heard that clearer messaging was needed to ensure that the EYFSP isn't seen as a school accountability measure, and instead it should be seen as a low stakes assessment in the sense that it has the primary purpose of supporting individual children's transition to year one and providing useful information to year one teachers, as well as parents and carers. And finally, as mentioned, we heard that the former approach to administering and moderating the EYFSP was time-consuming and burdensome for reception teachers, and it was leading to them spending quite a significant proportion of their time gathering evidence for assessment and moderation purposes, rather than on effective teaching and interacting with the children in their class. And many in the sector called for a greater trust in the professional judgment of teachers in doing that. And it was all of these views that formed the basis of the EYFS reforms that have now been 4 years in the making, and it was those changes that went through a pilot in 24 primary schools, a full public consultation, and then an early adopter year before they became statutory for all schools and early years providers in September last year. So the final changes to the EYFS are of course much broader than the changes to the ELGs and can be summarised as follows. So there's new, more detailed educational programmes across all 7 areas of learning, which we hope gives much greater guidance on what children should learn in the EYFS. These programmes have a really significant focus on communication and language and vocabulary development throughout, and they're supplemented by government's non-statutory curriculum guidance development matters. And this document includes specific guidance for the curriculum in reception year for the first time. And we do see that as a really important aspect of the reforms and hope that it will support teachers in delivering a really rich and broad EYFS curriculum, which we all know goes much wider than the specific ELGs that are assessed at the end of reception year. The other aspect of the reforms are clearer and more specific ELGs across all 7 areas of learning, and the new ELGs really mirror the new educational programmes in the fact that they have a much greater focus on vocabulary development throughout all 17. And they also aim to focus on the most important information for a year 1 teacher to know when a child transitions from the EYFS to the national curriculum at the beginning of year 1. The final aspect of the reforms is an overhauled assessment and moderation process. So that includes the removal of statutory external moderation and also of the exceeding judgment band. And I'm going to go into quite a bit more detail on the changes to the EYFSP assessment and moderation process shortly. So before I do that and talk about the changes that we've made to the EYFSP specifically, I did just want to go back to the purpose of assessment that is enshrined in the EYFS, because I think this sets a lot more of the context for those changes that we've made. So as mentioned before, one of the things that we really want to achieve through the reforms is cementing the EYFSP as low stakes, in the sense that it's not designed to be an accountability measure. And I'm going to go into that in more detail later on when I discuss the uses of the dataset. In terms of assessment more broadly, the EYFS Framework 2021 is really clear on the purpose of this in the early years, in that ongoing assessment should be formative, in that it involves knowing children's level of achievement and interests, and then going on to shape teaching and learning experiences that reflect that knowledge. It shouldn't entail prolonged breaks from interaction with children. It shouldn't require excessive paperwork. And with regard to the EYFSP, DfE does strongly discourage excessive tracking of children's progress against the ELGs throughout the year. And we are asking that all school leaders reflect on their assessment practices in light of this and ensure that the approach taken in their schools is proportionate and done with the purpose of supporting children's development and planning that curriculum, and not for the purpose of accountability or for reporting to governing bodies or trust leaders or local authorities. As stressed before, the ELGs aren't the curriculum, and schools shouldn't use them to plan teaching and learning experiences. And it's within this context that we've made the statutory changes to the EYFSP, which I will go into properly now. So I'll begin by talking through the changes to the ELGs themselves and how to use them. So as teachers and leaders will have seen, when familiarising themselves with the new EYFS, the new goals are much clearer and more specific in terms of what's required to meet the expected level of development in the EYFSP. We hope that this will make it easier for teachers to make the assessment based on their knowledge of the children in their class, and that it will reduce the need for excessive moderation to ensure the consistency of understanding. I think just to give an illustrative example of how the new ELGs are different to the old ones. So whereas the old ELG for listening and attention set out that children will listen attentively in a range of situations, which obviously leaves a lot of room for interpretation and can really see the need for the former written exemplifications there. The new listening, attention and understanding ELG sets out very clearly that children will listen attentively and respond to what they hear with relevant questions, comments and actions when being read to and during whole class discussions and small group interactions. So you can really see that the new goal provides very clear information on what that range of situations described in the original goal is. And this approach is taken consistently across all 17 goals. Another change that's been made is that teachers are no longer required to assess whether children who have met the expected level are actually exceeding against expectations. Although there'll be lots of children who have reached a level of development that goes beyond that described in the ELG, and teachers should obviously continue to stretch those children through a really high quality curriculum and pass that relevant information on to the Year 1 teacher, they no longer need to record that for the purpose of completing the EYFSP. And this change does aim to further reduce the amount of time that teachers have to spend assessing against the EYFSP and moderating judgments with colleagues to kind of determine which children are exceeding. And we hope that that will free them up to do exactly that, so delivering a high quality curriculum and both teaching and spending time with the children. That takes me on to the best fit judgment, which we set out in the EYFSP handbook. So as you'll hopefully have read in the handbook, we are saying that teachers should use their professional judgment and knowledge of the child to determine whether their level of development best fits the descriptor of the ELG. I think it's really important to stress that best fit doesn't mean that a child necessarily has equal mastery of all aspects of the ELG. And although the new ELGs are written in bullet point form, which is a change from the previous one, to stress that that is only to aid clarity, and it doesn't mean that teachers have to tick off each statement before a child has met the ELG. And we do want teachers to be using the descriptor holistically to judge whether a child is at the expected level or beyond, or whether their best fit judgment is that the child is still emerging against that level. Finally, a very significant change to the new EYFSP is the removal of the statutory moderation process. So while previously local authorities were required to externally moderate at least 25% of schools in their local area each year, that's no longer a requirement. It's been taken out of the EYFSP handbook, and schools don't have to partake in moderation discussions externally. Instead, the handbook's really clear that moderation should be a collaborative process with colleagues that promotes a shared understanding and offers opportunities for professional reflection. Previous versions of the handbook did set out that LAs have to offer training to schools on moderation, including through agreement trialling, and all of that's been removed from the handbook from 2022, and it's no longer a requirement for LAs. We understand that some across the sector have told us throughout the reform process that they valued moderation discussions as an opportunity for professional development and to share their experiences with colleagues. And we do absolutely encourage teachers to continue those professional discussions, and we hope that the removal of the requirement to take part in moderation training and things like agreement trialling may free up time to focus that CPD time on other aspects of delivering the EYFS. So, for example, planning a high quality curriculum and interventions for children who may be at risk of falling behind. One more thing I did want to mention was the removal from the handbook of guidance on completing a short summary on the characteristics of effective teaching and learning to sit alongside the EYFSP. So while that's never been a requirement, we heard feedback that the fact that it's included in the handbook could lead schools to think that it is something that they have to complete. So you'll see that the handbook now focuses on giving guidance on the statutory aspects of the EYFSP, and it doesn't include information on providing a summary of the characteristics of effective teaching and learning. So just to really stress that all requirements for completing the EYFSP are set out in the EYFS framework, and the handbook does give additional guidance in terms of how to deliver those requirements. And we do really encourage everyone to familiarise themselves with both documents so they understand what's required and what DfE's expectations are in this area. The handbook sets out a requirement with regard to submitting EYFSP data to the local authority, who will then submit that to DfE. We know that teachers will want to understand the implications of the changes on the dataset, and I'm going to move on to that in the next slide. Okay, so the EYFSP dataset. So as I mentioned earlier on in this podcast, we know that in the past the EYFSP has been used by some as an accountability measure for individual teachers and for schools as well. And this is one of the behaviours or kind of myths that we do really want to dispel through the reforms. And just the need to give really clear messaging on this is something that's come through strongly in our consultation and when we've been engaging with the sector and with teachers. So we are really aware that things like external moderation of the dataset and some of the previous guidance given by government, so for example former versions of the handbook, may have contributed to the data being used in that way. But both DfE and Ofsted are absolutely clear in our position that the EYFSP dataset is not designed to be an accountability measure, and it doesn't appear in school performance tables for that reason. So its purpose is to give a holistic picture of child development at the end of the EYFS and to support a child's transition into Key Stage 1. And it does that by encouraging professional judgment and providing the Year 1 teacher with important information. So through our engagement with the sector, we have heard examples of the EYFSP being used as an accountability measure, even for things like holding Year 2 teachers to account based on a child's previous EYFSP data. This isn't appropriate, and it doesn't take really important factors into account, for example, the age of the child when they reach the end of the EYFS. And we're also concerned by some of the behaviours that using it as an accountability measure could drive. So for example, incentives to use the ELGs as the curriculum rather than delivering the broad curriculum that the EYFS requires. The removal of external moderation does make it even more important for schools, governing bodies, LAs and all other organisations to refrain from using the data for accountability purposes and just ensure that it's used in the way that it's been designed for. So while the data will still be collected, the primary purpose of this is to give an overall picture of child development at a national and a local level to support policy decisions and research. But as ever, the data won't be published at school level. So both DfE and Ofsted will continue our efforts to give that joint messaging, including to LAs, school leaders, to MATs and to governing bodies as well. So as mentioned at the beginning of the vodcast, I did also want to go through the EYFSP case study exemplification videos that have been published this week. So just to begin with, as you'll all be aware, before the EYFS reforms, the former exemplification materials were written in format, and they did consist of over 250 pages of written guidance that really sought to build on the ELGs and give teachers, LAs, and others additional information to familiarise themselves with, which we do think was adding to the paperwork burden associated with completing the former EYFSP. We've also heard examples of some inappropriate use of exemplification materials, for example, using them to plan a curriculum or lessons, or planning activities to replicate examples given in the exemplification materials for the main purpose of ensuring that teachers had sufficient evidence to support their judgments, and to use that in moderation discussions to back those up. So it's for all of these reasons that we're not going to be replacing the exemplification materials in their former written format. We do also believe that the new ELGs are much clearer and specific, as I kind of gave an illustrative example of earlier, while leaving sufficient room for professional judgment, for that best fit judgment, not to warrant the same level of additional guidance as the former goals did. We want teachers to use the ELGs themselves and use their judgment based on those, rather than detracting from a trust in this judgment by giving lots of additional expectations from government that they must be looking out for when completing the EYFSP. So instead of giving written examples of children's work that kind of relate to the early learning goals, or videos that demonstrate children completing an activity sort of at the expected level, we've filmed case study videos in early adopter schools where the teachers involved discuss individual children in their class, and they do this holistically and describe things that they've seen sort of through their teaching and day-to-day activities that have given them the confidence that a child is either meeting or not yet meeting the expected level set out in the early learning goal. So as you can see on watching the videos, the teachers don't rely on physical evidence to support their judgments. They use their professional knowledge of the children. They've really prioritised getting to know the children in their class and planning what they want children to know and kind of delivering that high quality curriculum. So in the videos, some areas of learning are discussed together, which I think really demonstrates the holistic nature of the areas of learning. And you'll see that communication language does form a thread throughout kind of all discussions about children's development, and that really reflects its place at the heart of the reformed EYFS. So this next slide just gives a sense of what the videos look like. So you can see the kind of covering slide, and then there's a still from each of the 7 videos of the schools that we've worked with. We do very much hope that this approach will give teachers the confidence to approach the EYFSP in this way, and just give clarity both to teachers but to leadership as well on what DfE expectations and requirements in this area are. So there are a number of ways in which the materials should not be used, which I did also just want to take the opportunity to go through in this podcast as well. So for example, they're not designed to be a curriculum planning resource, in the same way that the old exemplification materials weren't originally designed to be used in that way. And we've deliberately chosen a range of different schools and approaches when filming. They're also not designed to set out an exhaustive list of examples that teachers should use when judging whether or not a child has met the expected level. The examples given are just the examples used by the teachers in those classes. It is also important to note that due to COVID-19 and restrictions with regard to going into schools, the majority of the filming did take place in the autumn term rather than at the end of the EYFS, and therefore the footage shown of children isn't intended to demonstrate children at the expected level of the EYFS, but is more there for aesthetic purposes and to really kind of give a feel for the schools that were chosen. So the videos aim to demonstrate ways in which teachers come to EYFSP judgments, but DfE doesn't expect teachers to replicate these discussions for every child in a class, and as I've really stressed before, all requirements for completing the EYFSP are set out in the framework, and all additional guidance in how to meet those requirements is set out in the handbook. So just to end the vodcast today, as promised, I have included a slide with links to additional resources and information that schools will find useful for completing the profile this summer. So firstly, of course, the EYFS framework, which was effective from September 2021, and this continues to be the go-to document that sets out all EYFS requirements that schools must follow. And secondly, I've mentioned this a number of times and just recently, but the EYFSP handbook, an absolutely crucial document that sets out guidance in completing the EYFSP each year. If something isn't in the framework or the handbook, there's no expectation from government for teachers to do it. And then thirdly, there's a link to the exemplification case study videos that I've mentioned in the previous slides. And it's very important to use these in conjunction with the context note that is published alongside them, which gives some of the similar messages to what I've given in this vodcast today. I've also included a link to Ofsted's guidance on inspections and the revised EYFS framework in the slides, because this includes some useful FAQs on what Ofsted will and won't be looking at. And I think that's really important for schools to be familiar with. And then finally, a link to Development Matters curriculum guidance document. As I've mentioned earlier and multiple times throughout the vodcast, the ELGs aren't the curriculum, and there are a specific set of goals assessed at the end of reception, and a rich EYFS curriculum is far broader than what's set out in the goals, and we do think that Development Matters will be a helpful document in supporting teachers to deliver the EYFS educational programmes for reception year. So thanks very much for your time in watching this vodcast, and we do hope it was useful in giving a good overview of the reforms and all the things that have changed in terms of the EYFSP, and we hope it's been useful in terms of signposting to additional information and resources as well.